Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. 10 countries, half the world's people, almost half of its GDP, and a whole lot of talk about rewriting the global order. The BRICS bloc, now BRICS Plus, wants to convince the world that the future is multipolar, that the age of the dollar, the West and the G7 is giving way to something new, a family of nations charting a different path. But behind the photo ops, is BRICS Plus really building a new world or just pretending to rehearse one? On this episode, we'll ponder those questions. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The German far-right Alternative for Germany party, more known under its abbreviation AFD, often hits the spotlight for being accused of pro-Russian and anti-immigration sentiments. While the party and its leadership are usually on the same page when it comes to the latter, it is the former that has caused quite a headache for the AFD. For example, one of its co-leaders enjoys making statements like these.
I do not see Russia as an enemy, nor do I agree with Foreign Minister Vadapol when he says Russia is always our enemy and will always remain our enemy. It is precisely this kind of war rhetoric that we must put an end to.
Such statements aren't merely isolated cases. Very recently, 2 AFD lawmakers, among others, attempted to attend a summit in Russia called the International BRICS Europe Symposium. The party's authorities made a move to prevent these members from attending, but the damage has been done. Many German lawmakers accused the AFD of being a sleeper cell loyal to Russia after it also came to light that the party made numerous parliamentary inquiries into military and critical infrastructure. The AFD does not have many political allies in its own country. Despite its surging in the polls, it will still most likely need coalition partners to govern, unless a dramatic shift occurs in Germany's complicated political theatre. The party has been trying to throw off the pro-Russian label to appeal to the mainstream, but cases such as these recent ones do little to soften such reputation.
And now we're zoning in on the explaining portion of our show. BRICS has been gaining both traction and importance in recent years, as the relations of several of their members with the West have soured. Yet despite their stated common goals, many of the countries within BRICS itself are decades-long rivals and even enemies.
Despite sometimes being touted as a sort of counterweight to Western organizations and institutions like the IMF or even the G7, BRICS itself is heavily fragmented and many of its members, like China and India, do not see eye to eye. It is seen by some as an every-man-for-themselves collection of states. BRICS comprises 10 countries. Brazil, Russia, India, China are its 2009 founding members. South Africa joined a year later in 2010. Iran, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Ethiopia joined in 2024, and Indonesia became a member in early 2025. Collectively, BRICS stands as a quarter of the world economy and nearly half of its population, which means that it is a force that cannot be ignored despite its internal divisions. Finance is perhaps the most important part of BRICS and the one unifying area. The organization is very interested in reforming the global financial system through various initiatives, as it is regarded as heavily US-dominated. While the group remains far from its goal, and its leading states are concerned over the influence particular members like Russia may have, its recent enlargement shows that there are many across the world who would like to see a change in the world order.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. The BRICS family now includes not 5 but 10 members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, joined by Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia and Nigeria. Together, they represent 56% of the global population and 44% of global GDP. But here's the catch. BRICS Plus is a crowd that doesn't quite agree on what it is cheering for. At the 17th BRICS Summit in Rio de Janeiro last July, the bloc announced its grand expansion, the biggest since its creation. There were promises of de-dollarization, multipolarity, and a new world order. The rhetoric was hot and the leaders were all smiling, yet the gap between what's said and what's done remains massive. That doesn't mean the group is irrelevant, far from it. In fact, dismissing BRICS Plus would be the West's biggest mistake, because while the grand vision of a rival to the G7 may be a mirage, the experiments happening under the BRICS Plus umbrella could reshape the global economy in quieter, more practical ways. Let's start with the first arena of power: resources. Between them, BRICS Plus members control much of the world's critical minerals and renewable energy supply chains. We all know about China's vast resources, but Brazil holds the world's second largest rare earth reserves. Indonesia leads in nickel, the metal that makes the EV battery possible. Add in South Africa's platinum, Russia's gas, and Iran's oil, and you've got a commodity coalition that matters. Their new Rio Declaration hinted at what's coming: coordination over pricing, production, and access. For decades, the West depended on OPEC's oil logic. Now, a new mineral logic is emerging. It's not a cartel yet, but it's an idea. And as Europe scrambles for lithium, cobalt, and rare earths to power its green transition, it is discovering an uncomfortable truth. Supply chains run through BRICS plus countries. For the US and its allies, that means diversification is no longer optional, it is existential. The second front is finance. BRICS Plus has been trying to chip away at dollar dominance. They have built local currency payment systems, experimented with BRICS Pay, and talked endlessly about de-dollarization. Realistically, less than 5% of global transactions happen outside SWIFT and the dollar, but the point is experimentation. Russia and Iran want to bypass sanctions. China wants leverage, while India wants autonomy. None of them can replace the dollar, but together they are building parallel systems that could, one day, make US financial power a little less absolute. When 10 countries with very different politics start voting together, even loosely, it shifts global dynamics. So, while BRICS Plus isn't an alliance, not militarily, not ideologically, not economically, it is a forum that's learning how to behave like one. Still, taking the group seriously doesn't mean taking it literally. BRICS Plus may not be building a new order yet, but it's building options, and in this case, options are power. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Jean-Pierre Cabeston, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the Hong Kong Baptist University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So we're looking at BRICS, or BRICS Plus, as a bloc, as a formula. What would you say are the main advantages today? The main points which could attract more and more countries to an expanding arrangement?
Yes, well, BRICS, it's more a forum than a formal organization. It started with 4 countries: Russia, China, Brazil, and India. And then a year later expanded to South Africa. Now there are more countries now, 10 countries are members of the BRICS. And the problem, we have more countries, it's harder to get a consensus on issues which have to do with the BRICS. If there is one common denominator among all the BRICS countries, is that they are non-Western. Well, if you consider Russia as being a non-Western country as opposed to Europe, European Union, or America, or Canada, or Japan, which are US allies or close to the United States. So that's what those countries have in common. But beyond that, it's hard to find a strong consensus among the BRICS member. And that's one of the limitations of the BRICS as an organization, or the forum rather than an organization.
So they are all proponents of the concept of multipolarity, which might be, as you're saying, both a strength and a weakness, because it's easier to attract new members, but if you actually want to get something done, it's going to be more difficult. Now, when looking at the issues which divide individual countries, especially within the original BRICS, where would you say would it be the easiest for someone to drive a wedge in terms of politics if someone wanted to do that? Would that be, for example, China and India? Or would there be other rifts that someone who doesn't want BRICS to become too much of a close-knit group would be perhaps willing to explore?
Yes, I mean, there are 2 major powers in the BRICS which today, for a number of reasons, are very close to each other, which are China and Russia. And the war in Ukraine has, in a way, demonstrated how close those 2 countries are, because China is not really neutral in the war in Ukraine; it's very much on the Russian side. As you pointed out, I mean, one of the major difficulties of the BRICS is to make sure that India and China on the same wavelength. Now, as you know, since the summit of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which took place in Tianjin in early September, it looks like Modi and Xi Jinping are, in better terms. They have both countries, India and China, have improved their relationship. But at the same time, if you look at the relationship as a whole, it will remain a mixture of cooperation and rivalry among two major nations of the global south, with the same size in terms of population, with the same kind of ambitions, because India is also very ambitious to win over and reach out, a lot of countries of the global south. So I think there are major limits regarding, how far China and India can work together. Another issue which you may be interested in talking about is the BRICS ambition to create a new currency, to de-dollarize the world economy. But as soon as you move into that direction, actually, you have each major member of the BRIC has its own agenda, and so they don't agree upon which currency should replace the dollar in international trade.
Well, wouldn't you say that the problem for the West is that the BRICS, even as a very loose association of countries, as a forum for cooperation, when you're actually tackling issues such as sanctions, you want as many countries as possible to be on board with that. But then within the BRICS, the mere idea that, we are a group of countries that don't really care about the dominance of the West. In fact, we would like to reduce the dependency of the dollar. We would like to make our economies operate in a way that doesn't necessarily need to follow the sort of agenda that the West is setting. That is enough for these countries to join together and say, okay, we're not doing that. And when you have major countries like Brazil cooperating with Russia economically, with fertilizer exports from Russia going into Brazil and all that, that will still leave a lifeline for any of these countries that might be involved at any given time in any sort of conflict or rivalry with the West. And they don't really need to have a common political agenda for as long as they have this underlying concept that we're not Western countries, we follow our own path. Mm-hmm. And this is, they might be on the same page on that, perhaps nothing else, but that is enough for them to make life difficult for Washington, for example, setting any sort of agenda globally, right?
All right. Yes, up to a point, you're right. What is interesting in countries like Brazil and India, they promote multi-alignment, which doesn't mean much. But what it means actually is that both countries are very much non-aligned, countries. And it reminds me the old non-aligned movement, which started in Bandung in 1955, but which has kind of survived over the years, but without much common ground, common objectives, apart from being critical of the West on some issues, but on other issues they do cooperate with the West. And in the case of Brazil, it's quite interesting how Brazil has managed to keep a balance among its major partners. It has kept a close relationship with the United States, including with Lula, the current president. But at the same time, with Europe, we shouldn't be forgotten in that respect, because Mercosur is about to conclude an agreement with the European Union, which is going to boost trade and economic relations between the European Union and Brazil, and but beyond Brazil, the CONOSUR, all the other members of Mercosur. So it's a good example of a country which has kept a balance, which is hedging actually against one another in order to enhance its room for maneuver. And I could apply, I think, the same kind of reasoning to a country like India, which has quite quickly reconcile with the United States. It's amazing, that how fast Modi and Trump are now back to the negotiation table, and Trump is trying to prepare a visit to India. So, and India, in addition, has been a member of the Quad and has not left the Quad, which is a security forum among four major nations in the Indo-Pacific: India, the US, Japan, and Australia. So again, and then I would add to that India has also developed a security relation with Europe, has decided to diversify its supplies of military equipment, including buying Rafale planes, fighters from France in order to reduce its dependence upon weapons and military equipment coming from Russia, which has been for a long time its traditional supplier of weapons. So again, multi-alignment means actually a strategy aimed at increasing the room of maneuver of BRICS members, and many of the BRICS members operate the same way.
One last question. Do you think that culturally all these countries, or perhaps almost all of them, share this sort of common goal to basically remain critical of the West because of the past, right? I mean, the West has a patchy legacy regarding these countries because of colonialism. Obviously, Russia is an outlier because it was not colonized by anyone. In fact, it was the colonizer, which is kind of unusual that it can still sell this sort of idea that it's like all the other countries in the global South that it's somehow similar to them. Nevertheless, do you think the West should perhaps modify its approach slightly and its attitude so that there is a feeling of equality rather than this sort of lingering sense of this sort of post-colonial condescending attitude that might still linger there, somewhere within the international relations between Western countries and the countries of the BRICS, or the global South at least?
Well, most countries became independent more than 60 years ago now, so it's an old story. And there is one country which has never been a colonizer, which is the superpower, the largest superpower today, which is the United States. So, I think the European Union has managed to develop with the global South, in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere, a much more balanced and much more, fair relationship. So. Now, you mentioned Russia, which indeed was a colonizer, but China was also a colonizer in a way, because the Chinese Empire colonized Xinjiang and Tibet, which are not part of China under the Ming Dynasty. So, the other countries are not entirely clean on that respect. And the other thing is that among the BRICS countries, you have countries which are democracies like Brazil and India, and countries which are authoritarian like China, Russia, and others. So here again, that's they have shared interests in diplomacy and on some economic issues, but at the same time they compete. And the problem with the multipolar world that you alluded to at the beginning is that those poles are also keen to compete with each other, and that's the new structure of the world. And beyond the ambition to develop and put together a much more credible form of multilateralism, it remains to be seen whether China and Russia and the heavyweights of the BRICS are ready to operate on an equal footing with smaller members of the BRICS and smaller countries outside of the BRICS. So here again, there's always a temptation for a pole to be hegemonic and to try to acquire some kind of zone of influence around the countries, around those poles. So that's one of the limitations, I think, of the BRICS today.
Jean-Pierre Cabeston was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight into the subject.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Ukraine has suspended peace talks with Russia. Kyiv believes that such negotiations only have a point if Vladimir Putin himself is involved, given the Russian government system.
It seems that for now, the matter of peace talks surrounding the war in Ukraine has come to a pause. After several failed attempts at convincing Russia to agree to a ceasefire, The actual attempts to bring Moscow to the negotiating table have been put aside by even the Ukrainians themselves. The reason behind this, according to Ukrainian officials, is lack of progress in the talks. What's more, the country's deputy foreign minister says that for years Kiev has been pressuring its Western partners to play a more active role when it comes to convincing Putin to attend such talks. The negotiations which had taken place so far, according to the Ukrainian side, were also quite unpleasant, as the Russian delegation had always brought with them files on their Ukrainian colleagues. The Russians would reportedly use information from them to verbally harass or bully the Ukrainian delegation.
Armenia says that the construction of the Trump International Route for Peace and Prosperity could start as soon as the second half of 2026. The route is a key part of a provisional peace deal agreed upon by Armenia and Azerbaijan.
The Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, also known as the TRIPP, is a land corridor comprised of a railway, gas and power line that is meant to connect Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave through Armenian territory. This connection is one of the last long-standing issues that stood in the way of the two rival countries achieving some sort of agreement. The route was agreed upon during the visit of both Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan and Azerbaijani President Aliyev to Washington earlier this year. One of the unresolved questions surrounding the route, whose construction is imminent according to the Armenian Prime Minister, is the role that American contractors will play in both administrative and security operations. The Armenian side has so far maintained that it will retain sovereign rights over the connection.
Russia is looking to boost awareness of the indigenous cultures and languages strewn across its vast territory. One of the ways in which the Kremlin wants to achieve this is through special holidays meant to celebrate Russia's indigenous cultures.
Russian law has long grappled with the problem of recognizing many of the country's minorities and indigenous groups. Only minority groups of fewer than 50,000 people get recognized, which means that hundreds of ethnic groups are left without not just official recognition, but also often without support. The Kremlin's two new holidays, the Day of the Language of the People of Russia and the Day of the Indigenous Minority Peoples of Russia, are seen by activists as shallow gestures. They believe that these symbolic holidays merely serve as a distraction from serious issues, the leading ones being the decline in the number of indigenous language speakers and the lack of education in native tongues. Other experts warn that the holidays serve as a way to offer state-sanctioned recognition while simultaneously stifling space for genuine indigenous activism and attempts at linguistic revitalization.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.